Hello everyone, this is Meenakshi De and I welcome you to another session of Your English Trainer. Today I am going to discuss modals and some of its types. Many people learning English find it difficult to understand modals as they behave quite differently from regular verbs and there are two or more modals that express the same meaning. Today's lesson will give you a basic introduction to modals, their characteristics, usage, and the basic differences among some of them. I hope by the end of this lesson, you will have a clear idea of modals and their usage. What are modals? Modals are auxiliary or helping verbs that refer to the attitude and behavior of the speaker or the subject in the sentence. They are indicators of advice, suggestion, permission, ability, likelihood, regret, obligation, recommendation, expectation, etc. In other words, modals assist in clarifying the meaning of the main verbs. For example, you should do the work. Here, the modal should expresses advice. You ought to look after your parents. Here, the modal ought to expresses duty. You have to follow the traffic rules or else you will be fined. Here, the modal have to expresses general obligation. Characteristics of modals. Modals do not change their forms with singular or plural subject. For example, he should exercise regularly. They should exercise regularly. In the first sentence, the subject is singular he. In the second sentence, the subject is plural they. In both the sentences, the modal should does not change its form according to the number of the subject. Next, modals do not have s, ing or ed added after them. For example, they can't do it is a wrong expression. The right expression is they can do it. Next, modals are followed by a bare infinitive, which means they are followed by an infinitive without to. For example, he should to go now is a wrong expression. The right expression is he should go now. Exceptions though in this case are ought to, have to, and used to. Next, two modals cannot exist together. For example, he can, will work all day long without getting tired. This is a wrong expression. The right expression is he can work all day long without getting tired. Now, let's look at the modal must. This modal expresses certainty or possibility. For example, you must be very tired after long hours of walking in the rally. Here, must expresses certainty, as it is natural for people to get tired after long hours of walking. Mrs. Watson must be about 50 years old. Here, must expresses possibility or inference, which means a conclusion drawn from evidence or reasoning. The speaker here has inferred Mrs. Watson's age on the basis of perhaps her appearance or any other information derived from her family, friends, neighbors, etc. The modal must also expresses necessity. For example, students must bring their own tiffin boxes to school. Why? There is no canteen in the school premises. You must get a driving license before you start driving your car. Why? This is the mandate or rule of the traffic department. The modal must also expresses obligation, which means duty or commitment. For example, I really must give up drinking. He must sponsor his daughter's education. Must also expresses strong recommendation. For example, you have high fever. You must take proper rest. You simply must visit Victoria Memorial if you go to Kolkata. Must also expresses prohibition, which is telling someone not to do something. For example, you must not go to the river without your parents. You must not bite your nails. It's a bad habit. Now, let's look at the modal have to. This modal is used to express certainty or surety. For example, that has to be the restaurant Susan was talking about. This has to be the dress which my sister wants badly. Must also expresses necessity. For example, I have to complete my homework tonight. I have to finish reading the 3 novels before the midterm. Have to is also used to express recommendation. For example, you have got to try this outfit. It's amazing. You have to try these pastries. They are so yummy. You have to go to the Spencer's today. It is offering great discounts. Have to also expresses obligation. For example, you have to return Harry's book before it is too late. You have to pay the fees on time. I have to pick up my mother from the airport at 3 p.m. When to use must and have to. Must is used to express internal obligation, which means the speaker decides something is necessary. Have to, on the other hand, is used to indicate external obligation, which means someone or something other than the speaker decides what is necessary, such as rules, laws, external authority. For example, you must wear a helmet while riding the motorbike. Here, the speaker thinks it is necessary to wear the helmet for the safety of the rider. I have to wear a helmet while riding the motorcycle. Here, the speaker is bound to wear the helmet by the traffic rules. Landlord to the tenant. You must pay your rent by Friday. Here, the landlord thinks it is necessary for the tenant to pay the rent by Friday. Tina has to pay the rent of a flat by Friday. Here, Tina has been asked by her landlord to pay the rent of a flat by Friday. Next, in interrogative sentences, have to is more commonly used than must. For example, what do you have to do in your office? This question sounds more natural than what must you do in your office? Next, must is not used in past tense and rarely in future tense. Instead, had to or will have to is used to indicate past or future obligation. For example, I had to clean the house before my mother's arrival. Here, had to indicates a past obligation. I must or will have to join my office on Monday. Here, must or will have to indicates a future obligation. Next, must is more forceful or has a stronger emphasis than have to. For example, you have to read Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. This sentence is less forceful than you must read Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. The next type of modal is should. This modal is used to indicate advice or suggestion, obligation, expectation. Examples of advice are: you should take regular exercise. You should see a doctor. Obligation: I should reach my office before 9 a.m. You should return Harry's book before he leaves for home. Expectation. Susan should have finished her work by now. Henry should be cleaning the house now. The modal should is also used to express recommendation. For example, you should visit the Taj Mahal when you go to Agra. You should watch the movie Titanic. Should is also used to share an opinion in the present about an occurrence, act, behavior of someone or something which happened in the past. For example, A. I had a terrible headache in the morning. B. You should have gone to see a doctor. A. The last date for applying for the job is over. B. You should have applied earlier. The modal ought to is a semi-modal, as like a modal, it does not change its form, and unlike a modal, it is followed by the infinitive to. This modal is used to indicate duty, necessity, moral obligation. Examples of duty are: we ought to abide by the rules of the college. You ought to be punctual. Necessity. We ought to save money for the future. You ought to go before the cyclone makes a landfall. Moral obligation. We ought to help the poor. You ought to repent for your misdeeds. The modal ought to is also used to express regret, which means to feel sorrow for a mistake. For example, I ought to have helped him. The regret is, I didn't, and now he is no more. I ought to have changed my diet earlier. The regret is, I didn't, and now I am sick. Ought to also expresses likelihood or probability. For example, Richard ought to have reached the airport by now. You ought to have received the letter by now. Please note, ought to is thought to be a little old-fashioned, more formal, and isn't so common in British or American English anymore. Ought to is rarely used in questions and negatives. When to use should and ought to. Both should and ought to are used to express advice, obligation, or duty. But there is a slight difference between them. Should is used to express subjective opinion, which means personal opinion, thought, or idea. For example, you should join a gym. You should water your plants regularly. Here, the speaker's personal opinion is expressed. Ought to, on the other hand, is used to express objective opinion, which means an opinion based on facts, laws, moral duty, unbiased or general obligation. It is more formal and old-fashioned. For example, we ought to protect our environment. Here, ought to expresses duty. The government ought to make more parks in this region. Here, ought to expresses public or general opinion. Please note, should versus ought to is equal to personal versus public or general opinion.
Next, it is common to use should and uncommon and very formal to use ought to in interrogative and negative sentences. For example, what should be done to help the poor? This is a common expression. What ought to be done to help the poor? This is an uncommon and very formal expression. Please note, should not can be contracted to shouldn't. For example, you shouldn't go there. But ought to cannot be contracted. For example, you ought not to spit in public places.
Here is a list of the basic differences among modals such as should, ought to, must, have to. Should and have to are used in informal speeches and situations. Ought to is used in formal speeches. Must is used in both formal as well as informal speeches and situations. Should and must express a subjective opinion, which means a personal opinion. Ought to and have to, on the other hand, express an objective opinion, which means a general or public opinion. Should has a weak emphasis, whereas ought to and have to have a high emphasis. But must has the highest emphasis. Should expresses general obligation. Ought to, moral obligation. Must, legal obligation. Have to, general law or obligation. Now we come to the end of this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Your English Trainer, in order to get more lessons on English grammar. Thank you.